Frank Wilson leaned back in his usual corner booth at the town's only diner, savoring the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The world outside was peaceful, the kind of slow, lazy morning he cherished. For a man who had spent decades protecting leaders and dodging bullets, this quiet life was a hard-earned reward. But peace has a way of being disrupted. The guttural roar of motorcycles broke the stillness as a gang of leather-clad bikers pulled into the parking lot. Frank didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He'd seen their kind before. Young men who thought the world was theirs to conquer. The leader, a tall, burly figure with a skull tattoo stretching across his neck, pushed through the diner doors. The chatter died down. The other patrons avoided eye contact as the gang filed in, loud and obnoxious. "Coffee!" The leader barked at the waitress, his tone laced with entitlement. His gaze swept the room until it landed on Frank, sitting alone, unbothered. The leader smirked and walked over. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from Frank without invitation. "You look like you've got stories. Care to share?" Frank looked up, his gray eyes calm and piercing. He took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Not the kind you'd understand." The gang leader chuckled, leaning closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" Frank set his cup down deliberately. "It means you don't scare me, son. You think making noise and acting tough gives you power, but all it does is show your insecurity." The leader's smirk vanished. "Watch your mouth, old man. You don't know who you're talking to. And you don't know who you're messing with," Frank replied, his voice steady. The room was silent. The leader's face twisted in anger. But before he could respond, one of his gang members called out, "Blade, let's go. We've got better things to do." Blade stood slowly, his eyes locked on Frank. "This ain't over, old man." Frank watched them leave, his expression unchanging. He picked up his coffee again, taking another sip as if nothing had happened. Outside, the gang laughed and revved their engines, their voices carrying into the diner. But Frank didn't react. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "It's Frank," he said when the line connected. "Looks like I'll need a favor." Frank sat on his porch that evening, his weathered hands resting on the armrests of his old wooden chair. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was the kind of quiet evening Frank had grown to love in his retirement. But tonight, his mind was far from peaceful. The bikers' threats were nothing new to him. He'd faced far worse. His life had been one long series of calculated risks and high-stakes encounters. This was nothing more than a petty nuisance. Still, there was something about this group, something reckless and unpredictable, that reminded him of younger, more dangerous days. His gaze drifted to the photo on the small table beside him. It was a black-and-white picture of him as a young man, standing tall in his Secret Service uniform. The president he'd protected back then stood beside him, shaking his hand in gratitude. That had been one of Frank's proudest moments. The distant hum of motorcycles in the night broke his reverie. The sound brought with it memories he'd tried to bury, memories of missions that had gone wrong, of friends lost, and of the weight that came with knowing he'd saved lives while ending others. It was the late 1960s, and Frank was deep in enemy territory. He'd been assigned to protect an ambassador during a high-stakes negotiation in a hostile region. The mission had gone smoothly until it hadn't. A convoy ambush left Frank and his team pinned down. His quick thinking, leading a decoy charge to draw fire away from the convoy, had saved the ambassador's life, but it had cost Frank something intangible. The scene replayed in his mind. The sound of gunfire, the shouts of his men, the heavy silence that followed when the shooting stopped. It was a memory that haunted him even now, decades later. Back in the present, Frank shook off the thought. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the contacts. There were only a few names left, people from his past who still owed him favors or respected his legacy enough to answer the call. As the night wore on, the roar of motorcycles grew louder. Frank turned off the porch light and stepped inside. He didn't bother locking the door. If the bikers wanted to test him, they'd regret it. The next morning, Frank awoke to the sound of glass shattering. He stepped outside to find his mailbox destroyed. its remnants scattered across his front lawn. On the side of his car, the words "Old Man" were spray-painted in jagged letters. A deep slash ran across the tires, leaving the vehicle useless. Frank stood silently, his face unreadable. He reached down and picked up the broken pieces of his mailbox, stacking them neatly by the curb. Then he turned his attention to his car, examining the damage. His expression didn't change, but inside, a quiet fire was building. As Frank worked, his neighbor Mary approached hesitantly. "Frank, are you okay? Those bikers have been causing trouble all over town." Frank gave her a small smile. "Nothing I can't handle, Mary." "But shouldn't you call the police?" she asked, worry etched across her face. Frank shook his head. "The police wouldn't know what to do with men like these. They're small-time bullies, but they're dangerous because they think they're untouchable." Mary frowned, but she didn't argue. She'd known Frank long enough to trust his judgment, even if she didn't understand it. That afternoon, the bikers returned, circling Frank's house on their motorcycles. They revved their engines, shouting taunts and obscenities. Frank sat on his porch, watching them with an almost serene expression. He didn't respond, and that seemed to frustrate them even more. Blade dismounted his bike and walked up to the edge of Frank's yard. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" Frank leaned forward in his chair. "You boys sure like making noise, but noise doesn't scare me." Blade smirked. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Frank stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've had your fun. Now I suggest you leave." The gang erupted in laughter, but Blade's smile faltered. There was something in Frank's tone, something Blade couldn't quite place, that sent a chill down his spine. "See you around, old man," Blade said, turning back to his bike. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated his target. That night, Frank made his move. He dialed a number and waited as the line connected. "It's Frank," he said. "I've got a problem, and I need it handled." The voice on the other end chuckled. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again. What's the situation?" Frank described the bikers' harassment in brief, precise terms. "I don't want a mess. Just make sure they understand they're in over their heads." "Understood," the voice replied. "We'll take care of it." Frank hung up and leaned back in his chair. He knew it wouldn't take long for his old allies to act. They were men who respected precision and efficiency, just like Frank had taught them. The bikers had no idea what they were about to face. The next morning, the bikers awoke to find their world beginning to unravel. Blade's prized motorcycle was gone, replaced by a single note. "Not so tough now, are you?" Another gang member discovered that his bank accounts had been frozen, while another received an anonymous phone call detailing every illegal activity he'd ever been involved in. The bikers were shaken, but they had no idea who was behind it. Frank, meanwhile, went about his day as if nothing had happened. But behind his calm exterior, he was orchestrating a lesson the bikers would never forget. Blade slammed the receiver of his burner phone onto the bar counter, cursing under his breath. Another gang member's illegal operations had been exposed to the authorities, and Blade's patience was wearing thin. The gang's confidence was crumbling, and paranoia had set in. "What's happening, man?" growled Trigger, Blade's second in command. "It's like someone's got a spotlight on us. We're losing everything." Blade paced back and forth in the dimly lit bar, his boots clanging against the concrete floor. "It's that old man," he snarled. "This started after we messed with him. He's got to have someone helping him." Trigger looked doubtful. "How? He's just some retired dude. What's he gonna do? Call his knitting club?" Blade's fist slammed onto the table, silencing the chuckles from his crew. "We're not taking him seriously enough. He's connected. Has to be. And I want to know who he's calling." Meanwhile, Frank sat in his living room, a calm smile playing on his lips. He knew the bikers were unraveling. They were impulsive, disorganized, and too arrogant to realize the depth of the trouble they were in. His phone rang, and Frank answered with a simple, "Go ahead." "We've disrupted their money and scattered their operations," the voice on the other end reported. "They're starting to panic." "Good," Frank replied. "But let's keep the pressure subtle. The leader needs to be the one to break. I want him to come to me." The voice hesitated. "And if he doesn't?" Frank's smile didn't waver. "He will." That evening, Blade made his move. Under the cover of darkness, he and his crew stormed Frank's property. They smashed the porch light, uprooted bushes, and hurled rocks through the windows. Inside, Frank sat unbothered, sipping a glass of whiskey. When the gang broke into his yard, Frank finally stepped outside. He stood on the porch, silhouetted against the dim glow of his living room. "Blade," Frank called out calmly. "You've been busy." The gang leader froze, momentarily caught off guard by the old man's poise. "You're done, old man," Blade growled, trying to mask his unease. "We're taking back what's ours." Frank shook his head, his voice steady. "You've made one mistake after another. You think this is a game you can win, but you don't even understand the rules." Blade's hand twitched toward the bat he carried, but something in Frank's tone made him hesitate. "This isn't over," Blade spat, retreating to his bike. "You'll regret this." As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, Frank picked up his phone again. "They're still trying to fight," he said into the receiver. "Let's make it clear they've already lost." The next morning, the gang's world took another hit. Blade's bar, the gang's main hangout, was padlocked by order of the city. A mysterious tip had exposed health code violations and illicit dealings. Blade's trusted supplier refused to take his calls, citing pressure from above. Meanwhile, Trigger discovered that someone had accessed his personal email and sent incriminating evidence to his parole officer. The gang was spiraling, and Blade was losing control. "What the hell is going on?" Trigger yelled as the gang gathered in a parking lot. "This ain't normal." Blade clenched his fists. "It's the old man. He's pulling strings." "How?" one member demanded. "How does some geezer have this much power?" Blade didn't have an answer, but deep down he knew this wasn't just a random vendetta. Frank Wilson was more than he seemed. Across town, black SUVs with tinted windows rolled into the local motel. Men in suits, all carrying an air of authority, filed into rooms. These were Frank's old contacts, former operatives who owed their careers and, in some cases, their lives, to him. One of the men, a stocky veteran named Harris, met with Frank at his house. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," Harris said, grinning. "It's been a while since I've been called out of retirement." Frank poured him a drink. "Glad to see you haven't lost your touch." Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "What's the plan, Frank?" Frank took a sip of his whiskey. "We let them stew for a little longer, then we close the book on this." By now, the bikers were terrified. Every aspect of their operation was falling apart. Their finances, connections, and safe havens were being stripped away, one by one. Blade's confidence was eroding, replaced by desperation. "I'm not running," Blade declared during a heated argument with his crew. "If we back down now, we'll never recover." "And if we don't?" Trigger shot back. "We're being hunted, Blade. Whoever's behind this, they're not playing games." Blade slammed his fist on the table. "We hit him where it hurts. His house, his car. Whatever he's got left, we burn it to the ground if we have to." The gang reluctantly agreed, but Blade's bravado masked a growing fear. He had never faced an enemy like this before. The bikers attempted one final act of defiance. Late that night, they returned to Frank's house, ready to cause more destruction. But when they arrived, the property was dark and silent. It felt too quiet. Trigger stepped onto the lawn cautiously. "Something's not right," he muttered. Suddenly, floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the yard. Men in suits appeared from the shadows, weapons drawn but pointed downward in a show of restraint. Blade and his crew froze, overwhelmed by the sheer professionalism of their opponents. Frank emerged from the house, his expression calm and composed. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. "Enjoying yourselves?" Blade stared at him, wide-eyed. "Who the hell are you?" Frank took a step forward, his voice steady and commanding. "I'm the man you should have left alone." Blade's confidence finally cracked as Harris flipped through the files, listing each gang member's personal details. Criminal records, hidden assets, family connections. It was all there. The bikers stood frozen, their bravado stripped away as Harris spoke with calm precision. "Trigger," Harris said, glancing at a page. Parole violations, illegal firearms trafficking, and an unpaid warrant in 3 states. You're overdue for a visit from the marshals. Trigger's face turned pale. Blade stepped forward, trying to salvage control. You can't scare us with paperwork, he snarled. Harris turned his sharp gaze on Blade. How about this, then? He tossed a photo onto the ground. Blade bent to pick it up, his face contorting in confusion. It was an image of his prized motorcycle, dismantled and lying in pieces in a warehouse. Blade's voice wavered. Who are you people? Frank finally spoke, his tone calm but commanding. I told you before, Blade. I'm the man you should have left alone. As Frank stepped closer, his mind drifted to his past. In his prime, Frank Wilson had been one of the most respected agents in the Secret Service. His missions weren't limited to protecting dignitaries. Frank had been part of covert operations, neutralizing threats long before they became public knowledge. One mission stood out in his memory. He had been stationed in a volatile foreign country, tasked with dismantling an underground arms network. It was a high-risk operation that had required months of planning and precision. Frank's success in that mission had saved countless lives, but it had also marked him as a legend among his peers. Blade clenched his fists, his anger battling with his growing fear. So what? You're some kind of big-shot retiree? That doesn't mean anything now. Frank shook his head slowly. You still don't get it. I don't need to prove anything to you. I've already won. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The realization was sinking in. They were out of their depth. But Blade refused to back down. He was too stubborn, too proud. This isn't over, Blade growled. We'll regroup. We'll come back stronger. Frank gave him a faint smile. You're welcome to try, but before you do, maybe you should think about what happens to people who underestimate me. The story shifts to a vivid flashback of Frank's most dangerous mission. He's leading a small team deep behind enemy lines, tasked with intercepting a high-profile assassination plot. The mission goes awry when their safe house is compromised. Frank makes a split-second decision to stay behind and draw the enemy's attention while his team escapes. The scene is tense and action-packed, showcasing Frank's bravery and tactical genius. Against overwhelming odds, Frank manages to survive, earning the respect and loyalty of his colleagues. This flashback mirrors the present, emphasizing the qualities that make Frank such a formidable adversary: patience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Back in the present, Blade's gang is falling apart. Several members abandon him, unwilling to face the mysterious forces working against them. Blade tries to hold the group together, but his anger and desperation only drive a deeper wedge between him and his crew. You're losing control, Trigger says during a heated argument. Face it, Blade, we bit off more than we can chew. Blade glares at him. So what? You want to run? Go ahead. I don't need cowards. One by one, the bikers walk away, leaving Blade alone. He finally realizes he's outmatched, but his pride refuses to let him admit defeat. Blade arrives at Frank's house alone, carrying nothing but his anger and a desperate need for answers. Frank is waiting on the porch, as calm as ever. You've won, Blade admits grudgingly, but I want to know why. Who are you really? Frank gestures for him to sit. You're not the first person to think they could push me around. But you're lucky. You get to walk away. Most don't. Blade scowls. You've destroyed everything I've built. Was that necessary? Frank's expression hardens. You destroyed it yourself. I just held up a mirror. Frank shares a story from his past, recounting a time when he, too, let arrogance cloud his judgment. He explains how he learned the value of respect, not just for others, but for himself. You've got strength, Blade, Frank says. You've got leadership, but you're wasting it. Men follow you because they're afraid, not because they respect you. That's no way to live. Blade looks away, ashamed. So, what now? That's up to you, Frank replies. You can keep fighting, or you can start rebuilding. But if you choose the wrong path, I'll be there to remind you why it's a mistake. Blade begins to change. He dissolves the gang, focusing instead on turning his life around. With Frank's subtle guidance, he starts organizing community events, using his leadership skills for good. The town notices the shift, and while some remain skeptical, others begin to support Blade's efforts. Frank watches from a distance, quietly proud but never seeking recognition. Frank's story spreads through the town. People learn about his past as a Secret Service agent and the sacrifices he made. He becomes a local legend, a symbol of resilience and wisdom. One day, a young man approaches him at the diner. "Are you Frank Wilson?" he asks. "My dad told me about you. He said you taught him what it means to be a real man." Frank smiles. "Did he now? Well, I hope he's living up to it." The young man nods. "He is. Thanks to you." Frank reflects on his life, content with the knowledge that he's left the world a better place. He spends his days quietly, enjoying the peace he's fought so hard to protect. Did this story of courage and transformation inspire you? If you loved it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share your thoughts or favorite moments in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.